Okay, well, Grover Norquist, I run Americans for Tax Reform. We were put together back in '85 by President Reagan to be the outside group to work on what became the Tax Reform Act of '86, back when the rates were 50% on the individual level, and then they were brought down to 28% as part of that tax reform. A lot of deductions and credits were reduced. A fair amount of the tax burden was shifted over toward the companies, even though they had a 35% rate as well. But they had more deductions and credits that got shed. But that said, at the end of the day, you ended up with lower rates, broader base, but it was revenue neutral. And so the Taxpayer Protection Pledge, which I designed summer of '86, the point was a lot of people were worried, gee, if we reform taxes by dropping the rate and broadening the base, what you'll have is all those deductions and credits and exemptions would go away, and then the rates will start to move up again. I mean, talk about the top rate. Well, the rate used to be 70% after the Kennedy tax cuts, and they were 91, 92% under Eisenhower, except the number of deductions and credits and exemptions available back then was much higher. A lot of that stuff was stripped out, so that more people were actually paying those rates, paying the top rate. So we were worried that you could end up having that drift up. The pledge was designed that way. Reagan was very supportive, and after that election, we had about 100 members of the House and 20 in the Senate elected in '86 who'd taken the pledge, made that commitment.
So do you see I'm sorry, is that okay? Do you see the pledge as relating to what the marginal tax rate is, or relating to the total value of revenues collected?
It's the second one. Well, it's both.
But you sort of described it at first as being about the rates.
Well, the concern was one of two things would happen. Either the rates would drift up, which is the concern most people had, or you'd end up, as in '82, with a broadening of the base with rates held where they were. The significant tax increase that happened in 1982 didn't affect marginal tax rates. Reagan in '81 got the tax rates down from 70 to 50 on the individual rate. Then in '82, Dole on the Republican side and Democrats on the House side promised the president $3 of spending cuts for every $1 of tax increase. And that would have been about a $577 billion spending reduction over a 5-year period. Instead, we got a $177 billion increase. So we increased taxes with the promise of $3 of spending restraint, and ended up with higher taxes, and spending increased more rapidly after the deal than it had been. So you not only didn't get the $3, you got $1 up, not $3 down. So there were two concerns. One is rates would drift back up, and the other is you'd have a rerun of '82 as a way to raise revenue, to make the tax burden heavier as a percentage of the economy. So it's one sentence, two parts. No raising rates, no broadening the base, unless rates come down. All revenue neutral tax reform is perfectly acceptable with the pledge. It's designed to fit tax reform. We want to broaden the base. We get this all the time at the state level. Well, we want to raise cigarette taxes because children will be protected from smoking. Fine, let's cut the cigarette tax, raise the cigarette tax, cut the income tax, dollar for dollar. Oh, well, we don't like the kids that much. Oh, so you just want the money? Yes, we just want the money. Okay, then leave the kids out of it and make your case for raising taxes. Don't tell us you're raising taxes when we're not raising taxes, we're doing children's health. You're raising taxes. Because they're not interested in raising taxes, cutting the income tax, having it be revenue neutral, and do what they claim they were doing on children's health. So that commitment, then you went into '88. George Herbert Walker Bush took the pledge. All the Republican candidates took the pledge except Dole. Dole won Iowa. In the debate just before New Hampshire, Pete DuPont handed the pledge to Dole and said, "We've all signed the pledge, would you?" And Dole acted as if he was a vampire, and he just tossed a cross into his lap. And he did this cringe thing that didn't translate well on TV. And he lost in New Hampshire. He was planning on winning the New Hampshire, and he was planning on winning the primary.
Who was the boxer who said everybody's got a plan until they get hit?
Mike Tyson.
Mike Tyson.
Yes, that's a good.
You know, And
Him and
I know we
Clausewitz.
want to hear the rest of this, but I also know that Rob Johnson has to catch a plane.
Oh, sure.
And I know he would love to jump in. He was particularly looking forward to talking with you today.
I'm quite interested because you talk about taxes or revenue neutrality, and therefore as a percentage of GDP, what resources we have in the short run. But what kind of sense of what we do as a society with our collective resources informs what that level of revenue should be?
The Constitution. Things that are mentioned in the Constitution are probably okay to spend money on. Things that aren't mentioned in the Constitution, you might wonder about.
When you look at comparative performance, like the German system or Scandinavian system, Chinese system, or whatever, do you derive any inspiration from how they choose to spend money? I mean, I don't imagine R&D spending in the public sector. Science, basic science is something mentioned in the Constitution, but a lot of people do find value in that.
They are, and the question is, if the government didn't do it, would it be done in the private sector? How much would you have? I mean, there's several levels on why one wants lower taxes and less intrusiveness by the state in people's lives. Step one is, in my interest, I think, liberty. I think people should be free. I think you shouldn't stick guns in people's noses and tell them to do things. And I don't think you should be shooting people unless they've committed a crime, as opposed to failed to do what you want them to do. Societies that are structured that way are icky and unpleasant, and that should be held. You want as little violence as possible organized by the state against people who didn't do anything to anybody else, rather than a lot of it. And so liberty is the first one. Now, it happens to be that if you have less government interference in people's lives, they are not only happier, they're more productive, and they create more jobs and opportunities for themselves and everybody else.
So we'd be better off without Social Security, for example.
Well, it depends who we are.
As
I mean,
our society would be better, freer, more liberty. We would all have greater liberty because we would be free to either eat cat food or not.
well, you've got Social Security, which for handicapped people with lower life expectancies or minorities with lower life expectancies, it's a wealth transfer from them to older white women, which is not exactly Robin Hood. It's more Sheriff of Nottingham in terms of who it transfers wealth from. If you make the list of groups and institutions people generally think the government's helping, those are the ones that are most damaged by Social Security. More people
So
that
you're
take
saying
their, well,
Can you say whether
compared to
you think
what?
we'd be better off without it or not?
Had we done instead what the
No,
Republicans
would we be
offered at
better
the
off
time,
without it?
we would be better off had you done, well,
You aren't going to answer the question.
I'm going to answer an intelligent question, which is, what are the alternatives? Okay.
The alternative would be
alternatives-
nothing. Would we be better off with nothing?
Okay, with 4 people, well, then what would have been the response? We now have 401ks, we have IRAs, we have people making certain
So if we-
decisions.
if we-
If your FICA taxes, which are now taken from you by force, were left with you,
Right.
and you were to put them into the stock market when you're young and into bonds as you get older, you would both retire with a significant sum, and the average American would have 3 times as much money coming in every year when they hit 65 as not, just looking at historical averages. Or you can look at what Chile's done and see it there. So Social Security has made everybody poorer compared to actual, fully funded, invested, so compulsory savings, that's what they do in Chile. You have to save 10% of your
Isn't that a
income.
guy-
put it in a
Yeah,
401k.
is it
Isn't compulsory savings making us less free?
Well, the question was, I mean, life is not all one or all the other sometimes. I mean, take a look at what the alternatives are. Nobody's arguing. I know the left's fiction is any criticism of the size of the state means you're arguing for not having a government. You know, like taxpayer activists are anti-tax or anti-state. Well, cancer doctors aren't anti-cell. They're against cells that kill people. I'm not against governments. I'm against governments that push people around too much.
Social Security is a good example because the concept of Social Security, as I understand it, as I view it, you can look at Social Security in a variety of different
Came
ways.
from
But
our
the way
German-
that I
German.
look at Social Security is that we're going to guarantee everybody some minimum subsistence level of life when they're too old to work, which solves a problem that we had in the 1930s of we had a huge economic downturn and we had a lot of people who literally did not have anything. And if people do not have anything and they're my age, well, that's not a social problem the government needs to solve because I can get a job. If you don't have anything and you're 80 years old, that's a social problem for your society. And so we solve that problem by guaranteeing to everybody a minimum income, and that I'm not for a national pension system that's designed to entirely place your own retirement savings and your retirement choices with Social Security, but we have a system that guarantees that everybody has something, and then they can and should save for their own retirement on top of that. If you take that away, if you say we're not going to have any safety net, we're going to let everybody save for themselves, they're going to make their own decisions, bad or worse, bad or good or bad, they're going to be left to their own devices. If they're fortunate, if they're smart, if they're lucky at the right times, they're going to have a lot of money and they're going to be able to go on cruises. If not, well, they're poor and they deserve to be poor because they made mistakes or they were in the stock market at the time then Lehman Brothers collapsed. And there's just
Social Security is presently structured compared to having the government say, take your FICA taxes, invest them in the stock market when you're young, and as you get older, put them in bonds, reduces your income when you're older by 2/3 from what it would be otherwise. It actually makes you and everybody else in the country poorer than before. That is not a helpful program, but that is a destructive program.
That's only if you assume that everybody's going to make.
And looking back 70,
look
back 70 years, and that's what would have happened.
But
Over a
the
70-year
past
period,
were a
including
predictor of the
recessions.
future, the richest people would be librarians.
I need to interrupt this, I do have
Sure.
to leave, I'm sorry. Before I knew we were gonna have a meeting,
Two things. I just want to make sure I share this with you. One was our letter to Warren Buffett explaining to him how, if you wish to give the government more money, you can do it. There's a website. He doesn't have to wait for anybody else. Also, we are going to be passing in Congress the Warren Buffett line, not pronounced buffet line, the Warren Buffett line, which will go at the bottom of your 1040. So I'll say, here's what you owe, and then just like the place for a tip when you have like a cab or go to a restaurant, you can add more if you'd like. So we're going to make it very easy for anybody who wishes to contribute. Also,
when we meet next, I would like to talk to you about the difference between characterizing these things as charity and having a different philosophy of justice and social organization. I think they're very different things. But anyway, I have to leave.
Okay, and then this is Maimonides' 8 levels of charity, and then Warren Buffett's giving the 9.
But again, the argument about Social Security, you don't really, your position that the appropriate role of government is solely the powers that are strictly enumerated in the Constitution doesn't merely take us back to the early 20th century, it takes us back to the 18th century. So for example, the Louisiana Purchase was certainly not enumerated in the Constitution. In fact, there's a very open question whether Jefferson had the power to do it. Are you going to argue that that in fact was a terrible mistake and that was not an appropriate role for government to take?
Actually, I think it was wisely done. I think it would probably pay to amend the Constitution to make it easier,
so
to
you're
make it
okay
clear.
with retroactively saying that we can do something if you decide that it's appropriate?
No, I think it would have been a good idea since we were in the business of accumulating territory. Once you realize, oh my goodness, we didn't have that in the Constitution, they should have amended the Constitution.
But there's so many, things like airports. I mean, the canal system, which was so essential for the early growth of America, which was a government-funded project. Today, airports, the transportation system, is your basic position that these are inappropriate roles for government? And my argument would be, if you think it's appropriate for people to make voluntary contributions when they think the government ought to raise more in taxes, are you willing to sign a pledge because you think the government should spend less, that you're not going to accept the American military protecting you, that you're not going to ask for the police force to come help you out if you've been robbed, that you're not going to ask for the fire department to come help you if there's a fire in your house? I mean, would you be willing to make that pledge?
Well, I think the question, there are several interesting points. Well, if I didn't have to pay taxes for those things, if I was saying, here's what we're paying to defend you by occupying Iraq for the next 10 years, and if you'd like to pass on that opportunity, you don't have to pay for it either.
Well, I would say if you are willing to make that trade-off, there's a very simple way for you to do it, which is renounce your American citizenship and move to Somalia, where they don't collect any taxes. And I think we would all agree the consequence is not a very happy society.
You've got to be kidding if you think Somalia's problem is too little government rather than too much and too many. Your ability to, I mean, the proper level of government, and Somalia has lots of governments. They compete with each other. They're called tribes. The national government, the one that we like to think of, they don't exactly have, but they have lots of government. And lots of people who collect taxes every time you drive past them on the roadblocks.
Would you like us to be tribes? Is that why you want to not
No,
fund the government?
I'm arguing that his suggestion that Somalia is an example of limited government. Look, what I would support, what the American people support, is limited government that protects your property, your life, and keeps the Canadians on their side of the border. Okay? So you want to have a national
You
defense.
want to talk about the American people and what they support? 86% of them support taxing people like us.
Yeah,
That's
and-
what the American people support.
And the most
today.
recent polls say that 3/4 think nobody should pay more than 20% of their income in taxes. So I'm with that. I much prefer that poll, which
So what if we
actually
brought us all
tests
up to
about.
20%? I mean, I pay 7%, and that's not that unusual.
How do you get to pay 7%?
I pay capital gains rates, and
Not
my
15?
deductions are about half my income.
Okay, so you're
I'm
not
paying about
working.
7% of AGI.
You're paying, okay, but
paying about
15%
7%
capital gains.
Yeah.
On
Well,
income,
right.
on money that you've already paid taxes on and you're now invested
Well, a
in.
lot of my income is ordinary income, but it's wiped out by my deductions. As you know, the deduction system, you get to use all your deductions against your ordinary income first, even if your deductions are associated with capital gains income. So what happens is you can have lots of ordinary income that would quote be taxed at 39%, but you get to wipe it all out with your deductions. Does that seem like the right system? If
Well,
you just brought
okay,
everybody up to
I'm-
20%, this was sort of what Warren Buffett proposed, was if you think 20% is the right level, why can't we at least say that people making over $1 million a year should all pay at least 20%? That doesn't seem unreasonable.
Well, then you have a candidate in Rick Perry, because he wants a 20% top rate. But I think if you want to know where the center-right is looking to go, because we have the House for the next decade, thanks to the wonders of redistricting, and we have the Senate starting in 12 for about a decade, because you've got 23 Democrats up in 12, 10 Republicans, only one of whom is vulnerable, and then in 14, you have 20 Democrats up, half of whom are in Republican states, 13 Republicans, none of whom are in
I don't
Democratic
think we
states.
need to argue about the politics.
I'm explaining where the country's going. And that's because the Republicans will hold the House and take the Senate over the next 4 years, getting close to 60 votes in the Senate if you look at where those states are. And the reason why we have so many Republican pickups coming in those 2 years is that Rove and Bush cleverly gave away all the Republican seats in 06 and 08 so that they could sneak up on the Democrats in 12 and 14 and take it all away. And this is where the Democrats never saw it coming. No, you didn't. They can't mean this. We said, yes, take them all.
I'll bet you saw it was coming too.
Yes, actually, no. At the time, I thought it was fairly stupid. But, what are you doing? Now I see what they were thinking.
revealed.
They know what they're up to. It just looks stupid. So when you get that, if you get a Republican president, the Republicans are looking to move in the following direction, and that is to tax consumed income at one rate, one time. So not do the death tax, not do capital gains taxes. When you earn $1, the government will steal some of it. I'm sorry, borrow, ask for, take some of it. Or you go to the retail sales tax idea. The government leaves you alone. If they catch you spending $1, they appropriate some of it.
Do you
through
worry
force.
at all, I mean, do you worry at all about the accumulation of dynastic wealth, about the fact that in the long run you can have a society where only a very few people have almost all of the money? I mean, it's very possible now, leaving aside any tax changes, it's very possible now for people to set up dynasty trusts where they're, you know, if you don't want to pay estate taxes and you want your assets to flow to your great-great-grandchildren and grow forever, you can set up a dynasty trust in South Dakota or wherever that's permanent and avoid estate taxes for your life and build up vast amounts of money, theoretically 100 years from now. Is there any danger to society in reproducing a sort of a European model where you've got people who are vastly rich so that they own huge swaths of the country and a large fraction of people who have almost no wealth?
Yeah, and actually earlier today we had a presentation by Hernando de Soto, who's done a lot of the work on ending up getting people more land wealth, more evenly distributed, where people actually control their wealth. In Egypt, over 90% of all the land and buildings are not legally owned. I mean, you have your house because you're there, but you don't have a title to it. You can't go borrow against it. It's tough to sell it unless all of your neighbors agree that, we all agree that that's your house. It's not, so you can't go to some court and say, hey, back up, my house, or my land. Tunisia is over 90%, Libya over 90%. and you've got 95% of all the small businesses, the hawkers and everything else, have no legal status either. So I would argue that those societies where you have the least protection of property rights, you actually have the most stagnation. England, the 6,000 families own more than half of the land, 75% of the land over there, and everybody else gets a 99-year lease. That follows from statism, not from a more dynamic economy. The top 1% over the last decade.
You do think it's bad in general to have a small fraction of the people controlling almost all the wealth in the country?
If it's organized through violence, yes. If the state is enforcing it.
If it just works out that way. Suppose that, I worked in the software industry where some people are just immensely more productive than others, right? If you have somebody build your website, and has the right algorithms and the right ideas, they can do things that 1,000 other people can't. Does that mean that the people who happen to have the talents that are valuable in society should just naturally own 1,000 times, 10,000 times as much stuff?
More importantly, are you in favor, do you oppose welfare for the able-bodied poor?
Do I think the government should take money from somebody who earned it and hand it to somebody who is capable of taking care of themselves and chooses not to?
No.
I guess I think that's probably not a good idea.
But you don't have any problem with wealthy people enabling their able-bodied children to not work?
Well,
because the point is, even if it's the people who earn the money in the first place, who accumulate that great wealth, since you're opposed to what you call the death tax, you must by definition think it's perfectly okay for there to be a small group of extremely wealthy people who control the vast majority of wealth who did absolutely nothing productive to actually earn it.
Except in a dynamic economy, it doesn't work out that way. Interestingly enough, it just doesn't. Even over the last 30 years, you've seen the charts on the bottom 20%, the bottom lower 20% income. Half of those people move into a different quintile each decade, and of the top 1%, half move out of that each quintile. So there's a lot more dynamism.
We have the lowest rate of social mobility in the developed world and the largest rate of inequality in the developed world. So does that, leave aside who pays for what, does that match up with your value system? That it is increasingly difficult for a person to move from one part of the income system up to another one?
Yeah, you want the government to get out of the business of interfering with social mobility.
Because that outcome is appropriate. That it is within your value system to say that a kid can be born into a neighborhood and has virtually no ability to get out of that neighborhood. That's appropriate. I'm just asking you a question. Leave all the money aside. That is, to you, that is an appropriate structure of a society.
No, I live in Washington, D.C., and I see what the teachers' unions have done to the public school system in this town and other major cities, where they've trapped kids into a situation where they can't do better. Now,
And
that's
so
the
you
government.
think it's the
If there were no
teachers?
public schools at all, then they would do much better at getting out of poverty? Because they could save their money, that they may, their parents are working minimum wage, they could save their money up and they could pay for a much better education. And then they would be millionaires.
We either have the present public school system and with government-run teachers' unions that fight any efforts to actually allow parents some control over where they send the kids to no schools in between. How about if you let every parent have parental choice and take their kid to a school that they want to go to, public or private?
So Grover,
I'm the moderator. You keep having these radical positions on either side.
So Grover, with a mother who's a public high school principal who has dealt, ran a school that was 2,000 kids in North Carolina, and it was a combination of the very richest kids and the very poorest kids. I think that that she would say that system that was set up to educate them was a key part of the people that she saw to be able to move out of their circumstances. But I just want to go back to the question that I asked you in the first place. Leave aside whether the teachers union is responsible for all ills in the country or not, and just say, okay, so they're responsible for a big chunk of them. And let's just look at a society whereby there are vast disparities of income, there are growing disparities of income, and there are decreasing abilities of any individual citizen to move from one level of society that they're born into a different level of society. Do you believe that that is an appropriate structure for a society? You're
asking outcomes, and I'm talking about
Yes,
liberty.
I am
Okay.
asking outcomes.
Okay.
So what do you think of that outcome?
I don't think it's a very good outcome. Now, the
Okay.
question is what causes that? And I
And
would
so
sit
what,
down.
but what would be your preferred outcome? So leave the method through which you get there aside.
No.
What is your preferred
No,
outcome?
no, liberty. Liberty is the preferred outcome. Liberty is the preferred way of doing
what if
things. Freedom is where you want to go. And if some people in
And
freedom
so you're
want-
telling me that a kid who grew up in the projects with no public education system with an abusive child has any freedom whatsoever to do anything?
Okay, your argument on where the government is, okay.
I didn't
I
argue
want
where
to
the
know,
government is.
I
I'm
want to know
arguing
when
where
the
that
guns
kid
come
is.
out, okay? When do the guns come out and they make you do stuff? If the government's making you do stuff and it's destructive, I'd rather they didn't. When they
Like
take your
say,
money
leave a
and...
park.
Pardon?
Like say, leave a park.
Oh, well, you know, that's New York. I think that's a big
That
mistake.
was nicely done, Charlie.
Thank you. I just thought it was an opportune moment to mention that there is a monopoly on the legitimate use of force in our country, and it is reserved by the 1%.
By the state, yes, and that's a mistake because the Occupy Wall Street is a tremendous asset, and it's a movement that I think will be very helpful in the 2012 elections, and I think it's a mistake to interfere with them continuing to annoy middle-class Americans. I think they need to be out there visible.
Why do they annoy
Okay.
why do you have a perception that they're annoying middle-class Americans?
The swing voters that are trying to decide which direction to go really find them annoying. And so I think they should get as much TV time as possible.
So, but
That's just politics.
okay, if you want to,
I don't live near one of those parks.
so you say that you say that your outcome is liberty. So there's no evidence that a system where you eliminate any role for government except law keeping and the very small number of things that you accept as as the role for government, there's no evidence that such a society gives people economic opportunity. You may have a sort of a religious belief that liberty must be good, and if we just get the state out of the way, then things are going to get better for everybody. But I worked at I worked at Google. We were very successful there. Company would not have existed without federal research funding.
The internet would not
exist in the form it exists federally. We would have some kind of technology. Things would be developed. But you can see firsthand, working in this area, the importance of funding for basic research that doesn't have an immediate economic payoff. Those things may be ideologically bad, but they actually have good consequences that we can look at and see the benefits. And so the question is, when your values, when your beliefs about, well, I believe that liberty must always produce this best outcome conflicts with what you actually see happening, don't you have to sometimes compromise between these two things? You're saying you're the reasonable person.
Well, I mean, you just go through life. There are societies where the government has more control and takes a higher percentage of the economy and people's wealth and has more control over their life, versus ones that have less. And you can, and different cultures behave differently. So just set that aside. East Germany and West Germany. West Germany was more my team. North Korea, South Korea. South Korea is more my team.
But
Mainland
people in
China,
West
Taiwan.
Germany, in Germany pay 60%.
Right, I'm saying compared to same ethnic group, all those things that you might otherwise say have some effect on people's capacity to save or forward-looking or any of that stuff. Where you had less government, you were better off than where you have more. You go to the United States and draw maps of the size and weight of government, city government, county government, city government, town, and look at growth, jobs, poverty levels. The more government, it's like crabgrass on a lawn. If you look at it, the darker it is for more government, the poorer and less cheerful.
What about innovation? What about progress? What about technology? I mean, I look at the graph. If I look at the graph of where, presumably, the fact that you can buy an iPad for $500 that does something that 10 years ago would have been impossible at any price. I know people who spend $1 million, building custom technology that isn't as powerful as what you can buy for $500 now. That's a benefit to people that comes from the business. It's a benefit quite aside from the profits that Apple makes. There's a benefit from progress. That progress, if you look at the progress that society makes, that happens all in the places that you denounce as having high taxes. It happens in Silicon Valley, it happens in Boston, it happens in New York. And it happens in those places because there is an investment by society in the opportunity to in the infrastructure, in the research, in the universities. You presumably are against any federal funding for universities. It happens because we're willing to invest in the things that benefit our society as a whole in the long run, and don't just benefit our society in terms of dollars, in terms of profits made by somebody, but make the society itself better. It seems like those are the kinds of things that you can have some alternate model and say, well, gee, if there weren't any federal funding for research in, basic technology, some corporation would do it because they would see that 40 years from now that it would enable all sorts of opportunity, but corporations don't work that way. Corporations invest in things that give themselves an individual benefit. If you want to invest in things that have a benefit to society, somebody has to do that that's not motivated by society. Maybe there's some of it can be done by charity. I give a lot of money to support scientific research, but the scale of the problem of the work that needs to be done is beyond the practical aspect that can be addressed by those kinds of means.
I was in high school and I never quite understood the argument that governments take the long run. Governments run by people elected every 2 years. Whereas the guys at Weyerhaeuser who plant trees that take 40 years before you can harvest them, or 20 years before you can harvest them, they take the short run view. Or the guys in, this is Grover G. Understood. Cops are like that. Thanks. Okay, I got you. Take care.
No.
Mrs. Giuliani.
Did you stage that for real? Did you all coordinate that earlier?
No. It's not Mrs. Giuliani. But yet, governments actually, our government, guys get elected every 2 years. They can't function. They think completely in short term. And this idea that somehow, you were talking about faith. I would argue that those people who believe that government is a black box, and when you say we're going to do something called Social Security, we assume that means that it helps older people. And really, compared to what? And just because the government says that they've built a plan which helps X or does X, when they put $1 in and label it defense, really?
No,
does that make it defense?
Obviously, there's government spending that's better. That's some things that are better than others. We have a political process that's designed to sort those things out. I just think, in your philosophy, there can't ever be anything that government can invest in that has a long-term social benefit, and that just seems so at odds with the world that I live in, because I know that I went to universities, that I see things that are funded by research dollars, that I benefit from public infrastructure. That we would only have private roads in your world.
And I go back, you say you're taking a reasonable, moderate position, but when you use terms like taxation is theft, and that the government steal these dollars, even by your own admission, you support certain roles that government fills. We didn't rely on the private sector to fight World War II. And, the military, I think, is a good example that, by and large, we feel does a pretty good job doing what they're supposed to do. They're not perfect, but it's well worth expending tax dollars, and I don't think that anybody has the right to say that when somebody comes along and says, hey, you ought to contribute to this thing that benefits us all, that you have the right to say that is theft.
Well, all government takes money out by force. It doesn't ask for it.
I don't disagree with that.
And I would argue that we should minimize the amount of force used in society. Not just by muggers and rapists, but by the government, where the government comes and forces you to either give them money or to do things. That should be kept to a minimum, not to zero. I'm in favor of the government raising money to protect property rights and have a defense to defend the country. I'm not particularly interested in doing other things with the Army.
But following up on David's point, you do dispute the notion the government can ever effectively invest in things that have a broader public benefit. Things like the road system, things like scientific research that are not enumerated in the Constitution, and yet, and I fully agree with Dave on this point, when you observe the effect, they certainly seem to have benefited an awful lot of people.
Okay, well, let's see, the federal government used to take and spend 20% of GDP, now we're at 25%, state and local about 12% of GDP. it'd be a little foolish to suggest that when you've been taking a third of the wealth of the wealthiest country in the world, that you couldn't have spent some of it in a somewhat constructive manner. But I would argue that you want to minimize, I mean, Solyndra was what you were describing, the government wisely spending our money to pay off bundlers for the president. I tend to think that's corruption and, yes, theft and wrong, not just on...
And there are plenty of, I've made plenty of investments that haven't panned out too well, and I don't consider myself corrupt for having done them.
No, with your own money, that's different. There's a big difference.
I think that
and one second, our rail system built privately, not by the government?
Wasn't built privately. The rail system was built by land grants.
They gave land away to people who then built the roads and so on. Okay.
That's essentially payment, and then the land became valuable because they built the road.
In fact, at the time, the government couldn't afford to build the railroad, so the land was a scheme to finance the railroad. In other words, they transferred wealth to the people building railroads.
And now, which railroads work? The ones that the government runs or the ones that are privately run? Which ones are functioning properly and which ones aren't in the United States? The ones that are privately run do much better than the Europeans.
The ones that are privately run have absolutely no public trust or public obligation.
The one that runs, I mean, there's a commuter rail that runs right by my house, and it provides an enormous value. It's always struggling because it doesn't have a dedicated funding source. And but in terms of its operations, it's providing a service that's invaluable.
Our freight rail's quite good. It's passenger rail. It isn't.
Yeah, but the passenger rail, there's passenger rail that's very effective. You presumably ride the metro, and it provides a service. It's more expensive than we would all like.
I've also been,
but you're glad we have it, right?
And I thought they were really cool, but I don't think it'd have been much fun if I was one of the guys spending my time building it, courtesy of the Pharaoh.
But I mean, do you ride the metro?
Yeah.
And do you feel just personally aggrieved at all the freedom that has been taken from you? I mean, do you wake up just
Are you
aggrieved?
kidding? I ride the metro. They loot people in Nebraska and Kansas to build the metro. It would be, when we last looked at this a few years ago, it'd be cheaper to buy everybody a rather expensive car who rides the metro than to have built the metro. So Washington, D.C.
But I'm asking you a different question. You're arguing that our government is infringing
Actually, it'd be cheaper to run buses
on our freedoms, and I just personally don't feel all that tied up, and so I'm curious that your experience as somebody who runs one of the most powerful conservative organizations in the country, how it is that you wake up every day feeling so hemmed in, so unfree. I mean, do you really feel so unfree?
What freedoms do you not have right now that you feel you've been deprived of?
Okay. If I was just worried about me, I'd go out and make more money and pay the extra taxes. Actually, my concerns are broader than that, and they're for the country. I think the federal government doesn't mess with my life or D.C. in the same way that it does for lower income people who are trying to get their foot up on the rail and who are told, oh, by the way, you have to go to this school that doesn't work because the teachers' unions pay us a lot of money, so sit down, shut up. What we used to have is that guy down in Arkansas, George Wallace, who stood in front of the schoolhouse doors, said to black kids, you can't get in. Today, the Ted Kennedys of the world stand in front of the schoolhouse doors and say to those kids, you can't get out to schools that teach.
He was wrong that he had to let the children into the school.
However, he was the state down there.
So that argues for the centralized power of the federal government, right?
No, because now
they need to be able to overrule.
I think you're missing the point.
Okay.
In one case, a politician stood in front of the schoolhouse doors and playing politics said to people, you can't get into a better education. Now, the government-run school isn't the better education, but the Ted Kennedys of the world stand there and say, because we get money from the teachers union, you can't get out. You can't go to a parochial school. You can't go to a charter school. You can't take the resources that we've accumulated, $14,000 per kid in this town, and if we give you $3,000, they could all go to a better school than they get in D.C. And this government stands in between those kids.
What private school has tuition of $3,000? I'd just like to know, because I pay a little bit more.
They don't, but we had a $3,000 grant, which this president killed, which was going to kids to say, if you'd like, here's $3,000 of the 14 that we spend on education. We're going to leave the rest with the teachers union and the bureaucrats. You get to take 3 to the school you want. And their parents were topping it off. but you have a lot of
You know,
parochial
it's
schools as
interesting
well.
to me that this
The President of the
conversation has
United
come all
States
the way
stood
around
between
to
those
demonizing
kids.
teachers, when in fact the wealth of the country has been plundered over the past 10 years. We had a historic tax cut,
I'm concerned
which is...
about the kids who aren't getting educations, and the
I am
answer is the
too.
government-run school that won't let, and the government-run city that won't let kids and parents have a choice of what schools to go to.
But your argument
You're
is just
talking
that
about what
government
kids
is
do.
inefficient. Your argument is that
no.
government is doing badly with the money that they have. My question is...
They're standing in between you and freedom and you and an education.
My question is, and I asked this at the beginning, where
They're
is
hurting
the
kids, and
evidence,
they should stop.
where is the evidence that this low tax environment that we live in is creating jobs?
You take a look at the 50 states and ask where people are moving to and out, and they're moving to the low tax states and away from the high tax states.
And the other question I
Towards the
have
low
is...
income tax states away from the income tax
to the
states.
bottom. You would expect that when you
Yeah, exactly.
People are moving and jobs are moving and jobs are moving.
If you had states that allowed more pollution and states that allowed less pollution, then you would see companies moving to places where they're allowed to pollute more,
And
right?
if-
But
and
that doesn't
people move to the
necessarily
more
mean
pollution?
that doesn't necessarily mean that you should have societies where
Visit
companies can
Eastern
pollute
Europe,
as much as they
visit
want to
Western Europe, and you get a better idea of when the state owns things and
Well,
land is
listen,
not
you could-
privately owned.
Well, you go to
have
Western
more
Europe and
private.
taxes are 60 and 70% there.
you
Compared to Eastern Europe where they were 100%.
Listen, you complained about your position being viewed as extreme, and then whenever anybody says that maybe I can afford to pay more than 7% of my income in taxes, you say, well, but that's communism and it failed. Don't you think that you're being...
I did not suggest.
You said Eastern Europe.
I said, no, you
question-
were asking,
the question we
how do you
started
know whether more government or less government? I said, let's look at societies that are divided down the middle. We've got a little test there, and it makes it a little difficult for you to go, oh yeah, that's not
There's more than
fair.
one dimension to what government does than more or less. There's,
You're
you know...
comparing an extreme situation where the government in East Europe was charging 100% tax
Right.
with a moderate position. And now you're saying, because it's better to be moderate than extreme, we want to go all the way to the other extreme and pay no taxes.
Massachusetts and Virginia, Maryland and Virginia. People leave Maryland, they move to Virginia. Jobs are created in Virginia, they're killed in Maryland, apart from federal jobs.
But people move from Virginia to
California and
Maryland
Texas.
for the opposite reason. For example, in Virginia, you can only buy health insurance from 2 companies, and the cost for an individual like me is $38,000 to buy insurance for a family of 5 in Virginia for 1 year. So I invested in a business in Maryland, and now I get my insurance through them, and it costs me $14,000 a year. So there's as much migration of individuals and businesses from Virginia to Maryland as there are from Maryland to Virginia. So I think you're asserting something which I don't believe is true.
Well, we can get you the chart because we actually put them out every once in a while where they go not only the number of people who move from each state, this is all inside, this is not immigration from outside the country, but migration within the United States. By any measure, the more government, the higher taxes you have, the more services, the more spending. People equate government spending with services. I've never quite understood that, but okay.
Well, if you're in a big
let's pretend
city,
it's the
obviously
same.
it requires more government than if you're living in the countryside. It
Well,
requires more schools
you get
and
a-
more teachers and more mass transportation
because
and more public services.
Per capita.
Yes. That's because it's a city.
Okay.
So I suppose cities benefit the economy. I think that's
Okay,
could be agreed upon.
Washington, D.C., I think it's our friends from, yeah, can you take this?
Yeah, I'll just let him.
Okay, thank you. He's concerned about being able to, he can't park because the cops are bothering him. I'm sorry, I've got to go do a TV show in a little bit, and the guy who's supposed to pick me up is circling around and getting tickets. The more government services, the more government spending, the more people leave those states and move to states where they spend less and provide less. And that's internal.
But there's no question,
not
but
overseas.
again,
And again, this is what people do. This is what people say they want.
Of course, there's a race to the bottom if you...
These people are moving there.
Well, of course.
They're not just moving their money, they're moving themselves. There's a race to the top,
That's
by the
because they
way.
haven't given any, they don't have, you have,
No,
you're
actually,
in a society with 15% unemployment.
Actually, the state that you're
and it's
holding up for
structured in such a way.
This has been true for years.
Is
People
there
have been moving
anywhere
to lower
in
tax states.
the entire history of the world, any society that you look at that is the model, the mental model that you look at and say, if we only had this structure, this is freedom, this is liberty. What is your mental map? Has it ever existed, or is it just a faith that if we do these things, a new nirvana will come about on Earth? Where is your mental benchmark for this?
I'm sorry, I've got this guy out there waiting. Hi, I'll be right downstairs. Okay, he just called again. Okay. The United States with improvements.
So it doesn't exist, it never has existed, but you think if we make these changes, it will bring about a...
I'm not arguing for nirvana. I'm arguing for better rather than worse. Again, if you guys have some sort of weird view that this is all on, off, white, black, yes, no. I think you can look at some countries and say that has more respect for people's liberty and lets people run their own lives, and as a result, they're happier. I think people should be free. There's free, there's completely free, and there's absolutely not free. And the more
I'm trying to understand what freedom looks like.
I think people should be able to go to any church, synagogue, or mosque they want to.
I think they should be
able to say, not in New York, evidently.
Why not New
Because you
York?
have demonstrators who run around and tell people they can't build mosques where they want to.
Right, most of them in your party.
Okay.
I mean, seriously, the people who opposed Part 51 and that wackadoodle Pamela Geller who put herself in a bikini and sent a picture of herself.
So freedom to go to any church or synagogue.
She's a left-wing thug.
All right, who else? What else?
Okay. Well, you want people to be free. You want people to be able to accumulate a house and whatever else they want to with the least amount of interference. Taxes should be at the lowest possible rate and the least interference in how people run their lives.
Because I don't understand, you know, based on my own life, I feel like I'm incredibly free. I lived in Russia for 6 months, you know, and I got to see what that was like. I feel incredibly blessed to be living in the society that I live in.
No, our government is probably less sucky than most governments in the world, okay? It's less intrusive and less damaging. Well, I've traveled around other countries.
I would simply say our point of disagreement, our fundamental point of disagreement.
Teachers' unions, the average private sector worker pay, benefits, pension, $60,000. The average state and local worker, these guys pay, $80,000. The average federal worker, these guys pay $120,000, okay? We run not in a Robin Hood society, but in a reverse Robin Hood society where the state goes out and takes resources from people in the private sector and pays people doing
I would say
80 and 120 versus 60 with all benefits. That's the challenge you have, and which, by the way, is over $400 billion in overpayments for government workers in the United States compared to the private sector. That doesn't count vacation days or whether the people at the DMV actually work a full day or do something productive.
So if government workers were paid less and did the same work, you'd have no problem.
If they were paid the equivalent in the private sector, you'd save $400 billion. You could take that into either tax cuts or debt reduction.
You have no fundamental disagreement with the idea that the government should exist and that people should do those jobs. You're just saying that they get paid too much.
Well, with many of those jobs,
and you don't
I'm
like
not
the
sure
people who work
guys
at the DMV because apparently they've been thrown in a big bucket with teachers and other overpaid government workers who we don't need anymore.
No, the DMV question is
well, you're trying to create a narrative about people who work at the DMV taking too many coffee breaks, and it's not true.
Okay.
So, but I do think we did have a little bit of agreement where we agreed that our government is not as sucky as many other governments. And on that high note of agreement, you've got to get off to our favorite television
all those
network,
other governments
and we've
that are
got to
more
get off to
sucky
some other meetings. But
spend more
thank
of
you
their
very much.
people's money as a percentage of the economy.
Thank you so much, Graber.
The better societies, the government's smaller.
Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time
And
to meet
too
with
much
us.
government in Somalia is not true.
Well, they don't have much government in Pakistan either.
Are you kidding?
Did he just say that?
The ability of people in the private sector to own their own land versus
There we go.
No, he said too much.
Oh, this is
The problem with Somalia is the total quantity of government they've got is too much.
Pakistan. Jeez Louise.
Thank you.
Take it easy.
Really appreciate your
Good to
time.
see you guys. Okay, and anyone who wants to send in more money to the federal government is free to.
I'll match you dollar for dollar. Every dollar you contribute to the United States
I'm not a
government,
big-
I will match.
I'm not a
2 to
big,
1.
Me too,
I'm not
I'm
a big
there.
fan of the farm subsidy program, so I'm not interested in sending them more money for that.
We're not calling for charity from the rich. We're calling for taxes. Thank you.
Yes, okay. And luckily, I will save you from having to follow through on that. Take care, guys.
Thank you.